September 1999. On the small Southeast Asian island of Timor, demands for independence from Indonesia, which had ruled over the population there since annexing it in 1976, had grown to such an extent as to spark open violence between those who wished to remain Indonesian and those who wanted the island to take control of its own future. This forced the United Nations to intervene, creating a peacekeeping force predominantly led by Australian Defence Forces to intervene and secure an open and fair referendum on independence. To assist with this difficult task, the Australian government turned to its two longest and most natural allies, namely New Zealand and the United Kingdom, for assistance. Dubbed the International Force for East Timor, or INTERFET, it included a Special Operations Detachment, which arrived in theatre aboard a Royal Australian Air Force C-130 Hercules transport, flying out of Darwin, Australia. Disembarking from the aircraft in their specially modified Land Rover Defenders was the small British contingent of around 20 troops, who were captured briefly on camera by a news crew. For the British civilian population back home, this was one of the first real glimpses they had had of arguably their country's most secretive Special Forces unit, the Special Boat Squadron, or SBS. While the SAS were a household name thanks to their rather high-profile exploits during the Falkland and the Gulf Wars, and their counter-terrorism action in Northern Ireland and in the London Iranian embassy siege, the maritime-oriented SBS remained largely under the general public radar. And yet their own history and exploits have proven every bit as extraordinary as their airborne counterparts, as they maneuvered the often murky world of covert operations. In this episode, we're going to examine the often overlooked origins of the SBS and cast some lights on this most shady of groups. Welcome to Wars of the World. Like much of the modern military doctrine, the genesis of the SBS can be traced back to the Second World War. By the summer of 1940, with the war not even a year old, Britain was left as the only main combatant opposing Adolf Hitler's thirst for conquest, with the fall of Poland, France, and most of Western Europe. The war had taken a hefty toll on the British military, and for all of his bluster in his speeches, Prime Minister Winston Churchill knew that even with the help of British Empire and Commonwealth troops, any notion of returning to Europe to push Hitler back was, for the time being at least, conventionally unthinkable. But not being one to live strictly by the rules, Churchill therefore opened his government up to suggestions for less orthodox methods of continuing the war. He created the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, a network of spies and saboteurs to operate behind German lines, and, as he put it, to set Europe ablaze. He also created the Commandos, a tough, hard-hitting raiding force that would land on the coast of occupied Europe, create as much hell as possible, and then retreat before German forces could fully counterattack. Against this backdrop of thinking outside the military box, entered a former bank clerk from Leeds, known as Roger Courtney. Bored with the bureaucracy of being a humble clerk, Courtney left Leeds behind to seek adventure in Africa as a hunter, writing about his experiences, which were then published in 1934. His sense of adventure was probably matched only by his quirky sense of humour. During a return to Britain, he was involved in a much publicised hoax at Loch Ness, where he used the foot of a hippopotamus that he had killed in Africa to convince locals that prints he had made with it along the shoreline were of the fabled monster said to reside there. This created a sensation amongst the local population, which quickly garnered the attention of the national press before the truth was revealed. After briefly travelling to British Palestine, where he served as a police officer just in time to combat the Arab revolt, he decided his heart was still in Africa, and so he returned to his big game hunting. But upon hearing that war had broken out, he travelled back to England to sign up for military service. He was commissioned as an officer with the King's Royal Rifle Corps, but was quickly enamoured with the idea of becoming one of the new commandos. At this early stage, much of what it took to be a commando was still being formulated, and this inspired Courtney to suggest to his superiors his idea of using collapsible kayaks to sneak up on the enemy based on his experience with them hunting in Africa. Courtney argued that canoes offered great advantages in stealth and secrecy, and foresaw small units approaching an enemy coast at night, undetected, whereupon they could conduct reconnaissance or sabotage and escape just as undetected. It was obvious to everyone that Courtney believed that he was onto something, and despite his enthusiasm, he was unable to convince his superior officers to at least let him trial the concept. They were unconvinced that the kayaks could approach enemy forces without being detected, and once they were, enemy machine gun fire would decimate the men paddling them, for there would be no protection afforded to them by their craft. Not one to be deterred, but knowing any words of his would just fall on deaf ears, he decided to give his superior officers a demonstration they couldn't ignore, even if that demonstration was given without permission. Upon learning that the infantry landing ship HMS Glengyle was anchored in the Clyde estuary, he decided to attack it, or so to speak. Now, you have to remember that not only were the crew on board, or indeed anyone for that matter, unaware of his intentions, but this was wartime, and the ship had armed guards on board who would have wasted no time in shooting an intruder, believing him to be a German agent. Yet despite this, Courtney succeeded in approaching and boarding the ship undetected by climbing up the anchor chain, after which he stole the cover from one of the deck guns before returning to his kayak and slipping away. In typically dramatic fashion, the soaking wet Courtney burst into a meeting of several Royal Navy officers at a nearby hotel and presented them with the gun cover. He then reminded them that had the Glengyle been a German ship, he could have planted a bomb and sunk it entirely on his own, armed just with his kayak. Despite this success, he was asked to repeat the feat, the embarrassed officers believing he could never do it a second time. They were wrong, and nobody was left in any doubt about Courtney's concept anymore. Promoted to Army Captain, he was given permission to raise a unit of 12 men to further develop the concept for operational use, initially dubbed the Folbot Section, in reference to the collapsible kayaks they were using, but it would later be renamed the No. 1 Special Boat Section, or known more commonly as the SBS. Courtney's unorthodox demonstrations had proven that the concept could work, and the first SBS force would come into existence under equally unorthodox circumstances. At the time, the whole Special Forces raiding concept was still being worked out. Even the commandos, prospective members of which were trained on the Isle of Arran in a series of truly grueling physical exercises, were largely making it up as they went along, meaning that operational uniformity between the individual units was often lacking. Being linked with the commando concept, Courtney found himself travelling to Arran, whereupon he was presented with a group of washouts from the commando course, dubbed 8 Troop. Although washouts, they were in fact highly motivated, physically tough, and angry at their dismissal, which they believed was more from poor leadership from their officers rather than their lack of ability. From this group, 7 went on to form the embryo of the first SBS unit. Others were found by word of mouth or reputation, or even simply from existing members talking to people in the pub who they knew could impress Courtney. Having found his 12 recruits, Courtney went about turning them into a Special Forces unit. Just as instrumental in this process as Courtney himself was his second-in-command, Lieutenant Robert Wilson, known as Tug to his comrades. A survivor of Dunkirk, and formerly a member of the Royal Artillery, his slight physique and charming demeanour concealed a tough, resilient and resourceful individual who believed in Courtney's concept and was just as eager to prove it. The training regime the two men put themselves and their men through was brutal, relentless, and often creative. One extreme exercise lasted 3 days and 3 nights, and involved them paddling more than 80 miles across the Firth of Clyde in Scotland, where they effected a landing at Craignish Point. Next day they paddled a further 20 miles up the Sound of Scarborough to the Isle of Carrera, and then after making a panorama sketch of the local seaplane base to hone their reconnaissance skills, they paddled their way back, the total distance covered in their little canoes being an arm-breaking 140 miles. Courtney also put his men through an extensive survival course to allow them to live off the land should they be cut off from their supplies behind enemy lines. To that end, he hired a rather eccentric expert to teach them such skills, named Jim Branson, the great-uncle of future entrepreneur Sir Richard Branson. Despite being a rather elderly gentleman, Jim Branson had cycled over 500 miles in a week to meet with Courtney and his men and pass on his knowledge, something that impressed the father of SBS. However, according to Courtney's retelling of this chapter of the story, his troops were hardly enamored with Branson's forest-based cuisine, but admitted that his recipes were at least filling for a group of Special Forces soldiers who had been denied normal rations for 3 days during the exercise. By the start of 1941, with Britain itself having been secured from German invasion, attention turned towards the campaign in North Africa and the Middle East against Hitler's Italian allies, led by fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Mussolini's campaign from Italian-occupied Libya into British Egypt towards the Suez Canal had proved an embarrassing failure, and he was soon sent in retreat, with British Commonwealth forces in hot pursuit. British forces now turned to securing the Mediterranean Sea, and in particular the strategically vital island of Rhodes, which at the time was still under Italian administration. Expecting an amphibious operation in the near future, the commandos, including Courtney's canoe soldiers, were deployed to Egypt in preparation for an operation to take Rhodes. It was during this period that Courtney met with another important figure in the SBS's origin story, 30-year-old Royal Navy Lieutenant Commander Nigel Clogston Wilmot, who was convinced that secret beach reconnaissance was vital for the amphibious operations that were still being conceived of to curtail Axis ambitions in the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. On paper, the two men shouldn't have got along. Courtney was the type who usually improvised his way out of a situation, thinking on his feet, while Wilmot was used to careful planning and details, and yet together, the two men's individual attributes proved a winning combination. While British commanders had a fair reconnaissance picture from aircraft and intercepted communications regarding Rhodes, Courtney and Wilmot campaigned for permission to undertake a closer look with their canoe. In March 1941, permission was finally given, and the two men found themselves squashed inside the cramped confines of the submarine HMS Triumph, until just 2 miles from the island and under a moonless sky, the submarine surfaced, and after assembling their canoe, they set off on their first mission. The two men spent the next 4 nights canoeing their way to land, conducting their daring reconnaissance missions of potential landing zones by night. The third night almost ended in disaster for Courtney, who, after being dropped off by Wilmot, suffered a crippling cramp from swimming in the heavy seas to the beach. His efforts to work through the pain as he writhed and rocked on the beach attracted the attention of a nearby dog, which barked loudly and revealed his presence. Although he was able to escape without being killed or captured by an enemy patrol. And then finally, his torch failed, which he was to use to signal to Wilmot in the canoe, although the canoeist's perseverance to recover his comrade meant that he eventually found him before returning to HMS Triumph. Their mission was a resounding success, the two men bringing back a wealth of intelligence on the enemy that could go into the plans for an amphibious landing by the commandos. Both men were decorated for their courage and dedication, with Courtney receiving the Military Cross, while Wilmot received the Distinguished Service Order and a promotion. More importantly, it proved the worth of the SBS concept. But sadly for the pair of men involved, it was something of a hollow victory. With Hitler's Wehrmacht storming through Greece, the focus shifted from Rhodes to Crete, while at the same time, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had thrown his hat into the ring in the desert, and his Africa Corps had reversed British fortunes. In the months that followed, the commando force as a whole, operating around the Mediterranean and Aegean, suffered appalling losses, partly due to enemy superiority and partly due to general mismanagement in how to properly utilize them. Being something of an orphan unit, Courtney's team had been spared much of the suffering in early 1941, but they were eager to get stuck in, Tug Wilson especially, and it was decided that he should be allowed to have a crack at the enemy. Teamed up with Royal Marines Wally Hughes, who was described as a man of few words but as tough as they came, the two SBS troops were transported up to the Italian coast in May 1941, with the intention of attaching limpet mines to enemy ships. However, that operation was reluctantly cancelled due to the appalling weather. Then in June, they joined the crew of HMS Urge, which had been assigned to patrol the southern portion of the Italian peninsula. The two SBS men had no set target. Instead, they were to sneak ashore at the earliest possible opportunity and basically find something to blow up. On the night of the 22nd, Wilson peered through the Urge's periscope at Sicily and noted a railway tunnel, which he reasoned was of vital importance to the massive garrison of Axis troops who were stationed there. He decided then that he and Hughes were going to blow it up. Having assembled their canoes, loaded their weapons and explosives, the two men set off in less than ideal weather. Rather than German patrols, their biggest threat came from Sicilian fishermen passing through the area, the two SBS men coming so close to at least one boat that they could hear the men aboard speaking. Yet incredibly, in the darkness, their tiny, almost silent craft remained undetected. They concealed their canoe and then made their way towards the tunnel, before planting explosives between the railway sleepers that would eventually be triggered as a train went over them, creating maximum damage. Their return journey back to HMS Urge was made complicated by a full moon breaking through the clouds and threatening to illuminate them. But again, the two men managed to avoid detection by quietly paddling out to sea to meet the submarine. Much to their relief, the Urge soon reappeared, breaking through the waves and began to recover them and their collapsible canoe. However, the air was yet to ring out with the sound of an explosion. Feeling their mission was a failure, they began to climb back into the bowels of the submarine when the captain called them back up and handed Wilson a set of binoculars. Wilson watched as the train chugged along the railway line towards the tunnel before the horizon lit up in a red flash, indicating detonation. The next day, Urge made a submerged recce of the scene using the sub's periscope. This allowed Wilson and Hughes to see the carnage which they had created. Within weeks, they were asked to repeat the effort, and together they instigated a two-man reign of terror, albeit a secret one, against various Italian targets over the remainder of 1941. At the same time, the SBS acquired another mission, inserting and retrieving agents from behind enemy lines, particularly in the German-occupied Balkans. Meanwhile, the Axis armies had become aware that they were under attack by a new clandestine special force, and they devoted valuable time and effort in trying to oppose them. However, they could not block the entire European coastline, and where there was a weakness, the SBS would exploit it. Courtney's concept had proven a tremendous success, but sadly for him, in December 1941, his health began to deteriorate, forcing him to be recalled to Britain to undertake an administrative post. That job included establishing a second SBS unit. Into 1942, the SBS units had become an intricate and capable special forces unit, and one whose daring exploits were among the most dangerous of the war, with death or capture always seeming moments away. Proof of this came in September 1942, when Tug Wilson's luck finally ran out, and he was captured in Italy, it being one of the few times he operated without Hughes. During his time as a POW, he escaped not once, but twice, but unfortunately was recaptured and held in a prisoner camp in Braunschweig, Germany, until the end of the war. Tug's loss was a blow, but the SBS's war went on, and with the impending arrival of US troops in North Africa, planners turned their attention back to Rhodes. The island by this time had two airstrips, from which Axis bombers posed a very real threat to Allied shipping in the region. A plan was therefore devised for the SBS to launch a raid against them, using similar tactics to their SAS comrades in the desert, and which they had already used against the German base on Crete. Dubbed Operation Anglo, the plan called for 8 members of No. 1 SBS, plus 2 Greek guides and 2 interpreters, to sail from Beirut aboard HMS Traveller and the Greek submarine Papanikolaos on August 31st to a beach near Cape Faralco on the east coast of Rhodes, from which the 2 target airfields of Kalatos and Maritsa lay 8 and 15 miles away respectively. The raiders landed successfully and then broke into their 2 teams to start for their targets. the Calatus raiding party, under the command of Lieutenant David Sutherland, reached a point overlooking the airfield by the night of September 11th and 12th. And after noting how the aircraft were dispersed, he decided on a simultaneous two-pronged night attack. Each prong was assigned groups of aircraft, upon which they would plant explosives. Despite being spotted by a sentry, they successfully destroyed 13 aircraft on the ground, but unfortunately, Sutherland and Royal Marine Duggan would be the only ones who were able to retreat back to the beach for their rendezvous with a second team attacking Maritza. Led by Captain Richard Allott, the Maritza raiders had even greater success, destroying 20 aircraft, but their effort to escape was blocked by the alerted Axis troops. In all, with the exception of Sutherland and Duggan, who managed to swim out to their awaiting submarine, the entire raiding force was captured, with one of the Greek guides being executed after a farcical trial for treason. Never being a large force, the loss significantly impacted No. 1 SBS, and as a result, they found themselves being absorbed into the SAS, although continuing with their role of landing on enemy coasts aboard their canoes to conduct reconnaissance and to raise havoc. Wilmot, meanwhile, left to form the similar Combined Operations Pilot Parties, or the COPP, to undertake covert beach reconnaissance, this proving vital for the success of numerous Allied seaborne invasions. Similarly, the Royal Marines formed the Boom Patrol Detachment, whose most famous exploit was Operation Frankton, where 6 folding kayaks were used to launch a successful raid against German shipping at Bordeaux in occupied France. These men being remembered forever after as the Cockleshell Heroes. Meanwhile, No. 2 SBS supported the American Operation Torch landings in North Africa before becoming part of Southeast Asia Command's Small Operations Group, operating against Japanese forces on the Chindwin and Irrawaddy rivers, and in the Arakan during the Burma campaign. Following the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945, Britain began its demobilization, and that included disbanding the SBS. However, their skills were retained thanks to the establishment of the School of Combined Operations Beach and Boat Sections, or SCOBs, at Fremington in Devon. This eventually led to the formation of the Royal Marines Special Boat Sections, which adopted the roles of the wartime SBS, the Royal Marines Boom Patrol Detachment, Wilmot's Cops, and similar special boat-based units. Sadly, Courtney would not live to see the new SBS. He passed away on February 15, 1946, from pneumonia in Hargeisa, Somaliland, aged just 46. The new Royal Marines SBS was soon in action in Palestine during the birth of Israel, and then in the Korean War. Over time, just like the SAS, their roles evolved to include security and counter-terrorism missions, guarding North Sea oil rigs, British maritime outposts overseas, countering Irish Republican terrorism, and in one of their more unusual operations, sailing on the ocean liner QE2, posing as tourists, in order to provide protection for Israeli citizens returning home following the horrific Munich Olympics massacre in 1972. The SBS played significant roles in both the 1982 Falklands War against Argentina and the 1991 Gulf War against Iraq, their designation changing to Special Boat Squadron in 1987. In more recent years, the SBS has inevitably served as part of the UK Special Forces Group in Afghanistan and Iraq, and have been heavily involved in anti-piracy operations around the Horn of Africa and hostage rescue missions in Libya and Nigeria. While not as celebrated as their SAS comrades in the news, books, and in fiction, that's how the SBS likes it, and it remains one of the most lethal, effective, adaptive, and above all, secret Tier 1 Special Forces units in the world.